Encore, I think you're muted.
I got the two things where I recorded and shared my screen, but I forgot to unmute myself. Thank you. Sorry, yeah, so we're gonna do the to-do challenge. I've already forked it over and cloned it down. Hopefully, pretty straightforward here. We're just creating a task list where we can add items dynamically to a web page, and then also have the ability to strike them out when we check them off. And then we're also going to be using local storage so that when we close our tab and then bring up the same page, we should have the same data present. All right, so we're just gonna get started with this. Again, if you have questions at any point, please stop me and we can go over it. This is meant to be more of a review of HTML. All right, so I have my challenge cloned and opened on my local machine, my README here, which we just saw. Let's kind of just dive right into it. So my first thing is I'm gonna create my HTML file. Again, normally we call it index.html, but you can name this usually whatever. So I'm going to call it todo.html just to change it up. All right, so we have todo.html. I am going to use my snippet that I've made. Also, VS Code has a pre-built snippet. So if you hit exclamation and click on that menu option, you'll get basically like a pre-baked general HTML template. So hopefully you guys are familiar enough with the HTML tag, head tag, body tag. So nothing too new here. I'm going to just use my own snippet, basically the same. So we have our head section with a title. So in this case, I'll call it my to-do list. I've already linked a JavaScript and style sheet, which I need to create. And then I have some just sections within my body. So subsections, I have a main section, a nav section. Again, nav is just a glorified div. Same thing with footer. Again, I can make this div and nothing's going to be really different. All right, so that's my basic HTML page. Let me create my script file and my style file because I probably want both of them eventually. So let's do that now before I forget. So I'm going to do script.js is what I've named that. And then style.css. I always forget if I'm making plural on that, so probably inconsistent. So that's plural. This is singular. Got it. All right, so now we have our three components. We have our HTML, CSS, and JavaScript files ready to go. Let's kind of start thinking about this. So for now, I'm not going to worry too much about design. My goal is just get something functional. Obviously, lay out my web page in some particular manner, and then we'll kind of iterate on top of it. So probably add in Flexbox later, add in some Bootstrap later, but let's get our core functionality going, and then we can kind of jazz up our design. So here, let's create a heading, pretty standard, my to-do list. All right, what kind of HTML element should we probably use for our list?
Unordered list.
Ordered list or unordered list?
Unordered.
Unordered, yep, either works. I mean, you might have a priority as in if you want to do things in order. Ordered list might make sense, but yeah, I like having the option of checking off any items. I don't have a particular order I need to complete them in. So I'm going to have an unordered list. And here, I'm going to create items. So I'm just going to create a mock presentation of my to-do list, and then I'm going to actually make a dynamic after that. So remember, unordered list is your parent element, and then each bullet point or each item is going to be a LI element, which stands for list item. So in this case, I could say, let's see, what am I doing this weekend? I got to do some laundry, and then probably wash my dishes. It's going to be, I guess, a weekend chore list. Maybe go grocery shopping. All right, so we have, some items of interest here.
Watch the playoffs.
Of course, a lot of good NBA games. Watch NBA playoffs. But yeah, there'll be several games this weekend, so I guess that'll be one generic item. Okay, so I have a few items here. One thing I want to introduce, I think Jack maybe mentioned something along these lines about going over VS Code extensions. So I think one that I want to share with you guys is called Live Server. I think someone else, might have been Jack again, mentioned Sandbox, or someone mentioned Sandbox. I think that's similar to Live Server. I'm not familiar with Sandbox, so I can't speak on it myself. There's something called Live Server, which you can get from your VS Code extensions. So if you install that, it actually gives you the ability to update your HTML and CSS and JavaScript, and your page will automatically adapt those changes rather than you having to manually refresh. So I have or had Live Server here at one point. I had it. Where'd it go? Okay. Not sure what happened to my live server. I got it. One sec. All right. I apologize. I have two VS codes open. One showing me what I want. The other one is not. Let me kill the other VS code. All right. Sorry about that, guys. Let me try to bring that up again. I'm gonna go there. Okay, we'll forget that. So there's something called live server. The reason I'm kind of flummoxed right now is in my footer, there should be, oh, there it is. All right, so if you install a live server, you should see like a little panel in your footer that says go live. I'm gonna click that while I'm on my to-do.html. That's gonna bring up a window for my to-do list. So that's on my other screen. Yeah, so again, when I make a change, I can see that basically live. So it's gonna be hard to do since I have only one screen going here, but let's try to minimize some windows. All right, so if I have my VS Code on my left side and then my page up here, basically if I make a change, I won't have to refresh my page constantly. So that's what live server is gonna do for me. So if I add a list item, let's just say I need to also, I don't know, buy new shoes. All right, so if I make that change, it should show up in my live server. There you go. So it took a second, but again, it auto refresh for me. It's not a huge, huge extension or a key feature, but it's kind of nice, especially when you're making like CSS changes constantly. Instead of having to manually refresh your page, live server will kind of manage that for you. So we have that. Okay, so this is what my to-do list looks like right now. I think this looks like pretty much what I want it to look like in the end. So again, right now I have static data, as in I've hard-coded my values, but I think my list looks satisfactory for now. So I think that's good. One thing that is in the requirements is we eventually have to have the ability to add new items. So this, we're gonna start kind of boxing up my sections. So when I say boxing out, I usually mean divs. So I'm gonna create an outer div for my list, just so I can manage that. And then another div, this is gonna be my input section. So let's add an input element. And this will be, say, add new task. Sorry, I'm gonna get rid of my split screen. I feel like I'm low on real estate here. Okay, so we have an input field, and then we're gonna have a button. So there are two ways you can do it. You can do this in a form, or you could just do it outside of the form. So I don't use forms unless I have to. They get a little more involved. So in this case, I'm gonna have an input and a button. They're gonna work outside of a form. And this will be add. Is everyone familiar with the placeholder attribute does on the input?
Does it just show up like in text? And that's about it.
Yep. It basically prompts your user when you are trying to do something. All right. So I'm going to go with split screen instead of, or sorry, dual screen instead of split screen. All right. So we added an input. We have a button. What else? So the idea here is this div should not be there. All right, so we have a div out here, div here, div here. Usually, anytime you have like sub boxes, it's a good practice to create an outer parent div. So what I mean by that is I have two divs here that are siblings, as in they're on the same level. So I'm going to create a parent for them. Again, you don't have to do this, but generally you'll probably wind up doing something that you want to do to both children, and then you're going to need a parent element in that case. So I kind of preemptively create those outer divs. Again, you can have a bunch of divs nested within each other. And yeah. Any questions so far?
Wait, can you go back again?
Sorry, I screwed up my typing here. This should be a close input. Hopefully didn't confuse you guys there. So I have an input and a button. Any other questions?
Okay, I see it.
That's the difference between a div and a section.
Yeah, I think we might have heard this before, but a section, I think, is just a glorified div. I think the section tag, so we're talking about section. I think this might be used by like certain parsers so that if you're creating a table of contents, I think you could pick up that, hey, you have a section, so actually add that to your table of contents. That's my knowledge of it. There might be other benefits of using section, but again, a lot of these tags are just glorified divs, as in there might be another attribute in here that a div normally doesn't have, but otherwise it's just kind of creating different different subspaces in your HTML, or I guess different sections, to use the same term again in your HTML document.
What's the difference between a div and a span?
Great question. So that one I can cover. So the div, this goes down to types of elements. Divs by default, are block level elements. That means each div you create is going to take up the entire horizontal span. So if we want to take a quick segue, let's make sure we understand this. So if I create two divs here, div, let's give these IDs. I'm going to give it ID 1 to be very poor naming, and ID 2. All right, and then I'm going to go to my CSS and let's give them some styles. So let's say, these numbers 1 and 2, CSS 1, and this will have a background color of something. Let's go with blue violet, and 2 will have a background color that is something else. Background color, go with coral.
I'm sorry, what is the CSS 1 and 2? Are they like the where are they referring to on the to do HTML?
Yep, sorry. So I snuck in some IDs here. So I gave it a name. So whatever name I gave it here, I'm trying to target those in my CSS. So we want to name these something else, like let's call this purple and orange. Again, these are just identifiers, so I could find them in my CSS or target them with my selectors. So again, hashtag means you're targeting by ID. If you use the period, that means you're targeting by class name. So in this case, I renamed these. So this was purple that I was going with, and orange. Okay, and then make sure I have some content here, because I always forget that. This would be box 1 and box 2. All right, so I'm going to save that. Let's see what happens. So again, I'm using divs here. Notice that box 1 and box 2, they take up the entire horizontal space. This is because divs are block level elements. A lot of, I'm not going to say most, but a lot of the common HTML tags you use are going to be block level. As in H1, this H1 is a block level element. All of these list items are block level elements. As in, I did not manually create a new line after like do laundry or wash dishes. They automatically create a new line for me because this one list element takes up the entire horizontal space by default. That's just the way HTML or browsers use these elements to basically create your flow. Span.
So block. Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to cut you off.
You're good.
So what other kind of elements are there if these are block elements?
So there's like different buckets. So you can have block level or inline elements. So there's just two, it's either or. One, they're either going to be a block level or inline, as in just the type of element they, how they render on the screen. So if it's not block level, then it's going to be inline. Inline means you could share space with other inline items. So to demonstrate that, I'm going to start using span. So div is a block level, basically a generic block level box. Span is a generic tag that's used for inline, as in if you want to share space. If I create a span here, let's just say box 3, and I'm going to create another box that's going to be of type span. So now these two spans should be able to share the same horizontal space, so long as like the content is not taking up the entire width. So if I give these an ID, so let's go with red. There's going to be some bright colors, and we'll go with green. All right, so I'm giving the IDs. I could target them in my CSS. So I called one red. We'll make that red, unsurprisingly, and we'll go with green. right, so it's giving background color so we get to see what's going on. All right, so we have red and green. Save that. Let's look at what our page looks like. Notice that box 2 and 3. Hopefully that green's not too dark for you guys. Box 3 and 4 are on the same level. That's because they are inline elements. Span is inline. Other common examples of inline are like anchor tags, as in if I wanted to create like a link for this NBA text, I could surround NBA with an anchor tag, opening and closing, and that's not going to create a new line because anchor tags by default are inline elements, as in they could share space with other items. They're not going to create a new line automatically. So again, span and divs are your most generic content holders in your HTML page. So just, if you need to use inline, you want to use span. If you want to take up the entire block, as in the horizontal space, use divs. But great question there. Again, both of them are generic. Both of them just hold content. They don't really have anything exciting going on with them, but it's just kind of how they render on the screen.
That just helped me so much. Thank you.
Gotcha. Nope. Keep asking those questions. Definitely want to make sure we get a good review in here. Okay, so that was our slight detour, but let's get back on track with our to-do list. So my goal earlier was adding this input and then adding an add button. All right, so we can get rid of these boxes just because the color scheme is grossing me out. So let's just get rid of these. All right, those should be gone. I guess I probably don't need the styles. They can be gone. Since I'm in here, I'm gonna change my font. I don't like the default serif font they have going here. Is that sans serif? I always forget. All right, body font family. Let's give it another font. I tend to like Lucida Sans. I'm gonna go with that. Save that. All right, there we go. So here's my new font. All right, so this is my initial attempt for my to-do list. Again, not the best styling, not much going on here, but effectively my vision here is I'm going to have a list of items I've added and then the ability to add new items. So if I ideally click the add button, I should be able to add a new list item. Okay, so we're going to actually, now again, this is a static web page. There's no functionality, there's no JavaScript kind of making decisions for us or doing any logic, but that's our next step here. Before we move into the JavaScript portion, any questions on what we've done so far with our page here?
So when you create an input tag, it doesn't have to have a type.
Correct. So the question here is, do you need the type attribute? And the answer is no. If you're outside of a form, you don't need to specify what type you want. If you're inside of a form, I think it is, I'm not sure if it's required or highly recommended. So again, if you're using a form right here, and then you have both of these in here, let's see what happens. So I'll create a form, should look the same, I believe. I shouldn't have to refresh, but yeah, nothing's changed visually. But now that you're in a form tag, there's gonna be some different behavior, as in I need to have a submit attribute for my button. I think the default is submit. So again, when you're in a form, buttons and maybe input controls work a little differently, but I'm not gonna use a form right now, just because I don't want that overhead. Forms are usually good when you need to post data. So it's going back to our HTTP lecture where you actually need to like submit data to a server. Usually forms are a good way to do it because it kind of gives you a nice package of data that you're sending to your server. But yeah, type, you shouldn't need to specify type unless you want to. Like you can make type the password, make that password. I think that should change it to dots. Yep, now it's dots. So again, you can kind of read up on different types you can set for input fields. You can make it numeric, I think, but for now, I think the default is text anyway. So that should be fine for my needs.
Ankur, I have a question if you got a sec.
Absolutely.
I may have missed it. Could you go, could you scroll up to where you were linking your JS? Okay. Okay, async defer. Yeah, we were having, I was having a reference issue, like when we were working on the program as well.
Okay, sorry, there's one thing I do want to comment on. So I initially always used to put async defer. This is actually kind of redundant and might cause some behavior that you don't expect. So I want to clarify this, so make sure everyone kind of understands. You can have async as I guess a value here, or you could have defer. using async defer is, again, kind of redundant and can lead to problems. So I want to make that super clear. So I need to change my snippet because that was what I was doing before. I could spell this correctly. So how do you spell async?
No,
Without
H.
the C.
Is it C?
Yeah, H. Sorry.
Gotcha. Okay, so using both of these is redundant. Let me talk about the differences. So if you use async, that is going to tell your browser to load this script asynchronously. We might not have said this word before or explained it before. Asynchronously basically means do it in parallel, as in go off in some other space and do the work while I'm doing some other work right now. In this case, your browser is loading your HTML document. When you say async, it'll basically say, all right, I'm going to spin off some other process that's going to load my JavaScript separately. Whenever that loads fully, it's going to execute your JavaScript file. That's what async does. It says, do it separately, so don't slow me down as I'm trying to read my HTML document. But whenever you load the JavaScript, as in whenever you complete the task, just run your task. That is what async is saying. Defer is a little different. Defer is basically async plus another capability. When you use defer, it's going to say load this asynchronously, but only do it after your entire HTML body has loaded. All right, so defer kind of has a baked-in async in it. So if you kind of Google this, most people are going to say don't use async and defer together. Use one or the other or neither. So again, I'm going to always want to use defer because my goal is that I want this JavaScript file only to load after my entire HTML document is loaded. Another way you can do this, I mentioned this in lecture, but I never did it. You could add your script tag down here. All right, as the last line before your body closes. If you add your script here, you don't need to do this defer because by default, your browser is going to read this as the last line in your HTML document, and then it'll load the JavaScript once everything else is loaded. Is everyone clear on?
Thank you so much.
Okay, yep, great questions. Keep them coming if you have them. But yeah, so defer, I always just put my script in the head section. That's where I like to have it. And I just use defer because that means load at the very end. But you could put your script tag at the bottom. I'm not a fan of that design, but nothing inherently wrong with it.
Could you also have two scripts? So one would run as soon as it loads, and then the other one would be deferred until everything else is loaded.
Absolutely. Yep. Great question. So let's say I want to have two scripts, as Don was asking or suggesting. I could have an init script that automatically is going to run when it gets to this line, as in when the browser parses line 6, it's going to load this initially. So let's say I want to do something just right off the bat. I can do that with this script, and then I could defer a separate script. So there's nothing limiting your HTML document to using only one JavaScript file. Likewise, you could have multiple style sheets. So again, we've been just going with one because we're not getting too crazy with styling and JavaScript, but in most cases, you're probably gonna have multiple files just to have that modular component. But yeah, you can have one that's loaded right away, and the other one can be deferred. That's totally kosher also. All right, so I'm going to get into my JavaScript logic. So again, I have a static page here, nothing too exciting aside from just content. I want to add some dynamic behavior here. So before I get to that, I know I'm going to need some IDs here. So I've created a bunch of tags and blocks that don't have IDs. That's not going to really work well with my JavaScript. So let's quickly add some IDs. So I'm just going to hopefully do this. Call this container. And we'll say ID equals lists container. I don't need to give IDs to my list elements here. They're just static. So we have our divs, or list has a name. Let's just say div ID here would be inputs container. And our inputs where I need the name. So input ID will be
Are there some tags that won't accept an ID property or attribute?
not that I know of. Maybe the meta tags. So we talk about meta tags that you put in your header. Maybe those don't take an ID, but for the most part, as to my knowledge, anything can take an ID. but definitely fact check me on Google. There might be some special cases that don't take an ID, but pretty much any tag you use should be able to take an ID. ID for my button is going to be add button. All right, hopefully those are good enough names. Let's get to our JavaScript. So my JavaScript, I'm going to start creating some functionality. Right now, I'm not worried about local storage, so that'll be our next task, and do this incrementally. My goal is to be able to type in something into my input and then hit a button that's going to add to my list here. So let's go about doing that. I'm going to need to create a handler. So here I could do onClick, and that's going to call some functions. Let's say add task. All right, so I need to create an add task method. Let's go about doing that. So const add task. It's going to be that arrow function. And in this case, we're going to do some stuff. So let's try to pseudocode it maybe. Find input elements. Grab text from input. Add text to as a list. All right, so I'm just gonna create some comments so we know all the tasks we need to do. So might need to do a few more things in this, but basically my first task is gonna be find the input element. So add task can be called when I click that button. The button is basically, we want to take the text that the user entered and add that as a new list item. So first thing we're gonna do is find this item. I'm gonna say let input equal, how do I find an element from my HTML document? Sarah, you're first on my screen. You are muted, unfortunately. Let's go with Eric. How do I get access to this element? I'm trying to get the text for this.
All right.
element.
Oh, going with him anyway.
Yeah, we'll go with Eric. We'll get back to you, Sarah.
Can you go back to the, yeah, there you go. Find the input element, input equal the ID tag name.
So we do need to use the ID tag name. So I believe I call this input test. I always forget my naming. Yep, input test, but I need to get the element. So here, this is gonna be the ID, but how do I use this ID to get an object that represents that element?
Can you go back to the other sheet?
Sure.
Through the container?
Yeah, so there's a couple ways we could go about it. One way is we could traverse this tree, the DOM manually, and basically go from node to node until we find what we're looking for. That can work, but there's a quicker way we can do it. So we have access to the document. Again, this is an object that already exists that is your DOM. So DOM we talked about on Wednesday, I believe, your document object model. This allows you to gives you access to that model that gets created by your browser. This has a method called get element by ID. And this, again, it's a handy dandy method that lets you basically pass in an ID of an element, and you should get the object of the model of the element. So in this case, input will be an object that basically represents this element for my HTML file. Again, the middleman there is the DOM. The DOM has created an object representation of this so that you can manipulate values or like attributes on it, and then it'll get pushed to the HTML document, or the browser will pick it up through your interaction.
Yeah, and I had a specific, like this specific thing I had trouble with yesterday with pair programming because I didn't quite get the document, because usually you're calling to something specific. I didn't get that it was like something baked in, like there's nothing named document.
Yep.
So
yeah, again, it's one of those things where like if you never coded in JavaScript, you're like, where is this coming from? Because normally you got to create variables yourself or import them, right? Yeah, so it's totally a fair a fair comment, but just, it's one of those things you just gotta know. Document is an object that just exists that your JavaScript can have access to. So we have document, we're calling get element by ID, and we're passing the ID name that we specified in our HTML file. This should give us the input. I always like checking to make sure like that we get something, because this naming is really fragile. As in, I could have had a typo, I could have renamed it in my HTML document. So there's no guarantee I'm gonna actually get an object back. So I always like checking. So I'm gonna do if input is not legit, let's just return. Okay, it might be good to like maybe print out an error message, but for now I'm gonna be lazy and just return, as in I can't do anything that I want here. So return. All right, so assuming input is valid, we want to grab the text. So let's do that. I'm going to create a variable called let's new task equal input.value. Again, value is an attribute for input field specifically. Normally, you probably want to do something like inner HTML, but for input fields, inner HTML is not the way to go. You want to use .value to actually get the value that user entered. So this should be the task that I want. Then we need to create a new list item. Let's see, who do we have here? Sean Kernan, you are first on my window now. How do I create a new list item? Like I want to create one of these bad boys right here, like list item, but I don't want to hard code it in my HTML because I don't know what tasks I necessarily need. How do I use JavaScript to create a new element, if you know?
Well, now that you have a pointer, or sorry, you need to basically reference the list and the end, and then add another, like using dot notation, add another dot list item to the end with all the attributes that you would put into the HTML.
Yeah, so there are a few steps we need to do. Down here I have my comments, so we need to find the existing list. So let's go with that. Let's say let's task list equals document. Again, we're going to use the same method. So this is why we give unique IDs to our elements. We do get element by ID, and I believe I call this task list, but I always need to double check. I called it to-do list.
Specifically, I think it's document.create item is the syntax you're looking for to create a new item.
Yep, that sounds correct. So here I'm finding the parent list. Here I wanted to create a new list item. So let's see, new list item equals documents. And I think Sean mentioned it, create elements. And then here you need to pass it what type of element you want to create. So in this case, I want to create a list item. So I just pass it li. Again, that's coming from the tag that we use here, li. So create elements will create an li item. And then we want to add some properties to it. So new list item. Who else we got in the audience? Just love hearing from you guys. So I see Mark Stanley. How do I add this text value to this list item that I just created?
You should be able to, that's a text value. Okay, so you want to create a text node, and you can.
When you say text node, could you clarify that?
Yeah, so it's so I guess you should be able to call document, and I think I don't remember the syntax off the top of my head, but I think you can call the document object and create a text node, which is basically like the inner HTML.
So you're sort of on the right track. So you mentioned the keyword I was looking for, which was inner HTML. So basically what I've done here on line 12 is I've actually created a new list item. So again, if you want to imagine what I've just done on line 12 is almost, not quite, I'm basically creating a list item here. So I basically created an empty list item. I want to insert text here. So new text goes here. How can this list item that I created, how can I get this new text goes here? How can I get this actual text on this element that I just created here? New list item is that list item that I just kind of mimicked. How do I get that text there? I think you said the magic word, so I just want to see if you got it.
Could you set new list item dot inner HTML equal to the new task?
Yep, you got it. So again, remember inner HTML is the the common way to update a value. The exception is like for input field, you use .value instead of inner HTML. But for the most part, again, remember our syntax or terminology here. We have a tag, opening tag, and a closing tag for our list item. in between, this stuff is called the content of your element. When you want to update the content of your element, as in what's actually shown, you want to use inner HTML. So yep, that is the attribute or the attribute you want to set. So in this case, or I shouldn't say attribute because attributes are for tags, but this is the property we want to set for the new list item. And in this case, it'll be new task. And new task is the text value we got from our input. All right, so we set that on here. Any other properties you might want to set on this? New list item dot ID maybe, and
you could set an attribute and set it. You could set an attribute and set the button attribute and then set it equal to the. Oh wait, I'm thinking of something different right now. Never mind. You're not doing the same thing.
That's cool. No, we might need to add some code here, but for now, I'm just going to with text. Like maybe we want to add ID or some styling even, but for now, I'm just going to add my text to inner HTML. All right, so we created a new list item. I guess I should put these with the comments that I've created. Then we want to add the text in the new list item. Then we need to find the existing parent list item, which we should have done here. Probably want to check it. So if task list, then add to it. We probably should find the parent earlier because if it doesn't exist, then we're going to fail out our task anyway. So I'm going to move this up here. Find existing parent. Parent doesn't exist. Then we want to return again. All right. Again, just go over this. These brackets are optional in this very special case because I have only one line in my if statement. So technically, I could leave this as is, and this will be fine. But usually good practice to have those brackets just in case I need to add a new line in here. It's already set. So okay, basically you're trying to find a couple elements. If they don't exist, I just want to abandon this. Probably want to write out an error message. But in the likely case that everything works good, we should create a new task, or sorry, grab the task from the input, create a new list item, add that text to the list item. And finally, we want to take our parent list. So task list is our parent. We want to append child. Again, this is a method on pretty much any element. And append child is going to add a new element nested within it. So what's happening right now, apologies, is we have our parent list right here, this unordered list. And all of these items are children. They're considered children because they're nested within the entire unordered list element. All right, so basically we're appending a child. So that's going to go at the very end. So we're going to append the new child item right here. Any questions? So again, append child is going to take care of that. As in, append child is the actual thing that's going to add it to the DOM. Up until this point, like even when we create a new element, this is just like a new element just hanging out in outer space. It's not attached to our HTML document yet. The way we attach it is we take an existing element that does exist in the DOM, and then appending child will actually add it to the DOM for us. So append child, I'll do new list item. So that's the name of my item. And there we go. Okay, so I coded this up. I think I followed all the steps I needed. Obviously, we want to test it. So I'm going to save this. Hopefully I didn't screw up any naming. Refresh this. All right, so I added an empty list item. It's going to bother me, so I need to get rid of it. Okay, so save that. Okay, let's add a new task. What else do we have here? Sarah, if your mic's working, what's something you're planning to do this weekend? Whether fun or like a chore or anything that you have in mind.
Honestly, nap.
Nap. All right, sounds a great to-do list item. So I'm gonna hit add. All right, great. Notice nap got added. One thing I can think of usability wise, I probably want to clear nap out of my input because I've added it. It's not user friendly to keep that in there. So it's not too much work for the user to type over it. But I think from a UI standpoint, we should definitely reset the new task when we add it. So like if I was gonna do, I don't know, go for a run. I hate running, so it's not representative of me. But notice I added this. I want to clear this, right? Because the user probably doesn't need to add it multiple times. All right, so I'm gonna need to probably delete those eventually. Okay, so let's actually do that quickly. Does anyone have an idea of how we can clear this for the user when they hit the add button?
If you're successful in return the item, have the value of the placeholder returned to empty, or not the placeholder, but the value of the input returned to empty. Yep.
Yep. I think that was Alex. Sorry, it didn't pop up on my screen, but it sounded like Alex. yeah, so we have this value that we read from. We could easily set the input dot value to empty string. So now this is going to basically clear the text and go back to our placeholder. Again, this placeholder attribute is basically what gets filled in automatically if that element, that input is empty, just to prompt the user. So let's actually see if that happens for us. So page refresh, so I lost my items here. So we had nap, I think. Okay, there we go. Nap got added. Notice that my input kind of reset to that placeholder, which is new task. So I can type something else, like go for a run. All right, there we go. Cool. Looks like that's working well.
Would you be able to access that placeholder attribute
Yep.
to do whatever you want in the JS file?
Yep. So again, pretty much any attribute you see here, like I guess ID, I'm not using any attribute, but yeah, placeholder is an attribute, you have access to it. So if we want to change it, let's actually do that for fun. So let's do input dot value. In this case, we're going to say another task. So my default placeholder is new task, and then my new one's going to say another task. All right. So yep, you can change attributes, assuming you actually change them. Placeholder. Again, placeholder is an attribute for the input element, so you could access it like this. Again, input is an object, so the object has methods and it has attributes. So save that. Let's do this again. Nap. All right, there we go. Now it says another task. Yep, pretty much any attribute you see in an HTML element. So like, you know, for image, you might have src or alt. You have access to all of those. For links, you have href. You can change those in your JavaScript. Again, that magic's coming from the DOM. The DOM just gives you access to those attributes in JavaScript. Okay, cool. So I'm gonna, I'll leave that in there. All right, my next item, if we go back to our README, is, all right, we created a list, create a form, button. All right, we want to check off things. So this is where I want to introduce, or not introduce, but go back to one other thing we do. So these list items right now have no attributes on them, but they can add event handlers to them. So my button has an on-click handler that I've hard-coded in there. So I know anytime I hit that button, I need to add a task. But for new list items, like I don't know what list items exist, so I can't just go in here and say on-click something happened, like do something, right? Because these list items are not going to exist when my page loads. So this is where you can add these event handlers through JavaScript. So to do that, I'm going to do that right here. My new list item that I create, I'm going to call list item, new list item. Then there's a method called add event handler, or sorry, add event listener. This takes in two parameters. Again, this is going to be reading from documentation if you're not familiar with it. But basically the goal of add event listener is to basically add a function that will be called when some event happens. And that event, you get to kind of choose from events that exist. So let's actually Google this. Add event listener. Let's see what events we have access to. Event type. Okay, so there's two parameters. I guess you could pass it a few extra ones if you want to. In this case, you pass it a type, and listener will be your function that will handle whatever thing you want to handle. So if I go to event type, click on it. All right, so there's a whole bunch of event types that can happen, like an animation can happen. I don't even know how some of these, like drag and drop wheel. So if you guys are using a mouse and have a middle wheel, if you use that on an element, you can definitely react to it. Again, a lot of events that can happen. I'm not familiar with a lot of these, to be honest. You could do mouse drag events, okay, full list, but for now, the only one I care about is click. So there's mouse, mouse. All right, so button, blah, blah, blah. Okay, anyway, I know it's called click. Sorry, I was trying to read that quickly. So click is the event that's going to happen. So that's when a user clicks, that's the click event. That's where this word is coming from. It's a pre-reserved word. It's not something I made up. I can't just say, you know, like do from click. It's not going to work if I just give it my own name. So you got to know what event, what the name of the event is. So it's kind of fragile. Again, not the best developer design, I guess, but in this case, click is the event name, and then I want to do something with it. So in this case, let's say toggle item state. Right, so this is gonna be a function I'm gonna need to create at some point. I could either create it inline, or the better design usually is to create separate functions. So I'll do const toggle. And again, if you guys have any questions, please let me know. This is gonna be a fat arrow function.
Oh, I did have a question about fat arrow functions. Compared to the old, like pre-ES6 version of functions, where they used to be, where they're hoisted, are fat arrow functions also hoisted?
Yep. Yep. Fat arrow functions are hoisted. Variables are hoisted. Yeah. So basically, this is just a function. It's just a different way to create it. The fat arrow function is the more, the hot new way to do it. So that's probably why Tom and myself are going to use it often. But you can use the traditional, just like declare a function, my function, parameters, and go like that. That's totally fine. It's going to work same way.
The only difference is once we get into React, if you use the function keyword, like the old way of writing it, there's a couple more steps you have to do to get it to work properly.
Yeah, that's where you gotta like bind data members. It gets kind of annoying. So yeah, fat arrow function kind of just save you some headaches later on. All right, so toggle item state. Goal here is basically when I click on an item, I should be able to check it off or strike it through. So I'm gonna go do that. I see we're hitting lunchtime soon, so we'll deal with that in a bit. All right, toggle item state. So here I'm going to get item and then change strike through state. So yeah, I wanted to get to local storage, but I think I'm running out of time. I will try to make sure we get to it at some point though. All right, so get item, I need to get an item. Question is, how do I get which item was clicked, right? So I might click on, item, do laundry, or I might click on buy new shoes. The way I have it designed is the same handler is going to be called no matter what happens. Does anyone have an idea of how can you figure out which of these items were clicked?
Do we have to pass in this?
Good idea. This won't quite capture it. So this is, again, kind of knowing more about events. So when you actually, when an event actually happens, the framework is automatically going to pass that event as a parameter. So what's going on in my code is that this onClick handler is going to pass an event to my function. I don't have to pass this to my function. It automatically gets passed to my function. This event is going to have a whole wealth of data for me. One of those pieces of data is going to be which element was actually clicked on. All right, so this is probably where I want to start creating an ID. So if I do new list item, give it an ID, I'm going to have a global variable. Let's call it list. Let's next list ID equals 0. All right, so I'm going to assign it the next list ID, and I'm going to increment it on one line. This might seem kind of crazy to you. It's shorthand. Again, I could just do this and then do next list ID plus equals 1. Same thing. Basically, have unique IDs so that when I get here, I should be able to investigate what I clicked on. Before I kind of just assume, let's actually debug this so we could, see that I'm not kind of lying to you. Events. Okay, so I'm going to put a breakpoint on line 17 because I want to investigate what event is. I'm going to actually kill my live server, so that can go bye-bye. I want to run my HTML file, so I'm going to go to run, go to start debugging. It's going to ask me what I want to launch. I want to launch it in Chrome. That will take a hot second to come up. There you go. Toss that over here. Guess my other web page is still open. Blow that up a little bit. Okay, so we have our list. I added a handler just to review what I did with my code here. I added an event listener so that when I click on this new list item, it should call toggle item state. Unfortunately, my existing list items do not have that baked in, as in if I click on one of these, it's not going to work. But let's do this dynamically. So save this. All right. Napping was one of our list items. So now this nap list item should have an event listener so that if I click on it, if I did everything correctly, as in if I wired everything correctly, it should call toggle item state, automatically pass it an event object, and I should break on this line 37. So again, it's always fragile, so I might have missed something. Let's click on it. Again, my mouse is on it. I'm just going to tell you I'm clicking. I know it's hard to see. All right, I clicked on it. So notice I hit that breakpoint now. I'm in toggle item state, which got called because of this. Again, when I clicked on it, toggle item state is the responsible party, as in it's going to react to that event. You can actually have multiple event listeners. So add event listener. Like if I created another add event listener and I had click in another function, both functions would get called on the same click event. So I'm not sure off the top of my head what good use cases to have multiple listeners for the same event, but it is possible. All right, so I'm broken on an event here. Let's actually investigate it. So if I look at my left panel here, I have event. Notice it's of type mouse event. So this is where you can read documentation. I have that page open, mouse event, and you kind of investigate what properties you can access on it. So you could, client X, for example, will tell you what X coordinate was actually where your mouse was when that click happened. So if you need to know like where exactly the mouse was, you have access to that. Again, there's a whole wealth of information in this mouse event. All right, so if I open up my panel here, again, I have access to all those attributes. So I have Alt key. That means the Alt key was Alt key pressed. It says false. So you could shift click stuff, you can control click stuff, Alt click stuff. That's what that might be useful. Notice client X and Y. So apparently my mouse is at coordinate 59 and 204 when I clicked that list item. Gonna keep going. The actual thing that I care about is target. So keep in mind there's a target property in your mouse event. I'm going to expand that. This is another object that has more values in it. I'm going to go down scrolling in target. There's a whole list of information. What I care about is ID right here. There's an ID field. So this will let me target the actual list element because I gave it ID of 0 when I added it. Now I can extract that ID and know which exact list element I want to target. Okay, obviously, given ID of 0 is not descriptive, you probably want to have a little bit more descriptive IDs. But in this case, I know exactly what element in my HTML document got clicked. And I could do stuff to that element directly rather than trying to guess or figure it out in some other manner. Any questions about the event objects, kind of what I just wired up here, what we're looking at? Please ask.
That started going pretty fast, but basically with the event listener, you're adding functionality to that special text on the page that you just made.
Yep, so that list item I added, I can have the ability to click on it and something actually happens. Normally when you clicked on a list item, nothing happens, right? Because by default, list items aren't meant to be clicked on. So there's no event that's there's no reaction to that event when you click on a list item or do any other event with list item. It's meant to be static data. But in this case, we're trying to make that list item a little more dynamic where we can actually click on it and something is going to happen.
Where is that information about the listeners stored? How do you troubleshoot what listeners an object has?
That is a great question. That I'm going to refer you to Google because I don't know off the top of my head. There's probably some way to figure out which event listeners exist on which item. I can probably Google that quickly, but there's a way to inspect it. I'm not sure how it's managed. Like that's going to be some magic that's happening behind the scenes. How how this event gets mapped to event listener and how it actually triggers and gets handled correctly. How this event gets passed. Again, that's beyond my knowledge space. But there's some magic behind the scenes that automatically does it for you.
Yeah, but I'm pretty sure you can attach any event listener to any element. I'm pretty confident, or most elements, if not all.
Okay, so I know we're running to lunchtime, so I'm going to wrap this up with the styling thing, and then local storage. I'll either record it on my own and upload it to YouTube, or we maybe cover it after lunch. We'll figure that out. So just to go about this, so my goal here is when I click on something, I want to strike it through or unstrike it. So let's see. This is where I'm going to use CSS. So we've not used CSS much, but there's a way in CSS to strike out an item. So if I want to create a strike class, I could. So text declaration, I believe. All right, Google this.
I believe it's the text decoration.
Okay, yeah, that's what I thought.
It
but-
is.
All right,
Yeah, I think the attribute's like line through or something like that.
gotcha. Yep,
It's line through.
you got it. You guys know your stuff. All right, so basically this will, if I give it a strike class, it should be line through. So just to see that in action, let's do that for laundry. Because I hopefully want to get laundry done. So class, and that's going to be class of strike. If I say that, notice that now my text is actually stricken through. Now this is hard coded where I just did it, but I might want to do that more manually. So instead of creating a class, I'm just going to use text declaration. This is the key thing I want to do. So I'm going to get rid of this. And then in my HTML, in my JavaScript, my goal here is one, I got to use the event to get the ID I want. So if we remember event.target.id is going to be the ID of the element that was clicked on from my entire HTML document. So using that, I should be able to get the element that I actually want. So maybe I should name these a little better. So I'll do list item plus that. And then, so this ID will be correct. Let's say let's list item equals documents get element by ID. All right, so this should get me the list item. Probably should check it. So if list item is not good, you probably just don't want to proceed here. So we'll return. All right, so assuming we get a valid list item, I'm going to use the ability to update the style. So the style property on basically any element lets you access the CSS styling. So in this case, I have style, and then we have text declaration. Again, this is another opportunity for me to point out. Notice that here, text declaration is camel cased. I mentioned this on Wednesday, but in CSS, property names use a hyphen to separate words. That is not allowed in JavaScript, as in that format. This hyphen will be interpreted as like a minus sign. You can't name variables or properties or whatever with a hyphen. So again, when you want to access it in JavaScript, use camel case. Okay, so list item.style text declaration. I want that to equal line through. Where'd it go? Line through. So now this is going to be a string value. So in this case, my string value can be, just with the hyphen. All right, so I set that. All right, let's see what happens. I'm going to hit save. Hopefully everything's wired correctly. Refresh this. Why is that still stricken through? Oh, right. Wait, so I think nap was one of our tasks. Enter. All right, if I click on nap, it goes to my breakpoint. I'm going to get rid of that breakpoint because I think we're good. And continue. All right, I got hello because event is true. Sorry, bad code there. Then refresh. Okay, so add nap, and I'm going to click on it. So I'm going to click on it right here. Notice it got stricken through because I updated the CSS style. Again, this is all capable with JavaScript, has access to any of the attributes or styling for the element. So in this case, I've struck it through. I can't do that for these 5 items because these are all static, right? I hard coded those in. They don't have an event listener. But yeah, let's actually just kind of code this up. So I'm going to get rid of these items. This is going to be empty list. One last thing I need to do. I want this to be toggleable. So for example, let's say I could check off a list, but maybe I need to uncheck it off for whatever reason. Maybe it's a task that it needs to be redone or I didn't do it properly. So I'm actually I want to add some logic here. So let's say let is checked off. And that's going to be, I'm going to actually investigate this property. So we'll do a quick comparison. And I want to see if it's line through right now. So if this current style is line through, that means it's been checked off. Then I want to do the opposite. So in this case, is checked off. I'm going to use a ternary. I don't know if you guys are familiar with ternaries in JavaScript. We definitely talk about them, but they're good to use in this case, where I have 2 cases. Either it's checked off or not checked off. If it is checked off, I want it to be none, as in I don't want any text declaration. Else, if it's not been checked off yet, and I just clicked on it, that means I want to strike it through, as in check it off. So in this case, line through would be my style. Okay, so now I have a conditional, as in I check the current state of the style. and then I do the opposite. So I toggle it, which is the goal here. All right, so if I refresh my page, let's add some tests. So I have laundry, I have a nap that I'm probably looking forward to, run. All right, so now I could go up over any of these items and check them out. So I could do laundry, nap, and run. Sounds like a good weekend there. Let's say I actually didn't get my laundry done, or I have another laundry load to do. I could add a new task for that, or I could uncheck this. If I click on it, notice it becomes unchecked. So we're just toggling each time we click on it, it toggles. And that toggling is the smart logic we added in through JavaScript. So JavaScript is checking the style and then doing some action based on that style. All right. So that, yep, that covers, adding some event listeners. The last thing, that last major thing we need to do is deal with local storage. And I know there's a lot of questions on local storage based on the retro. So I would love to do this in front of you guys, but we also have a breakout session in the afternoon. So let me ask a question. Would you guys want to do this in person as in after lunch? Because I don't want to eat into your lunchtime like I've done in the last couple of days. Would you want to do it as a live lecture where we talk about local storage and go about that and also introduce Bootstrap? Or should I just pre-record it and upload it to YouTube and you guys will watch it on here? The only caveat there is we might need to push back the breakout session that's scheduled if we want to do it live. So I'm not sure the best way to get the audience consensus, but what do you guys feel?
I said we go
I guess
over
just the YouTube, so we can get like best of both worlds.
What was that? Sorry.
I'm gonna put my vote in is like upload it to YouTube. That
Okay.
way we get that and plus the Python object-oriented programming.
Gotcha. Yeah, I mean the breakout session is going to happen regardless, but yeah, sure. I could record this probably over lunch or during the afternoon, and then I'll upload it. So it should be on the week 4 playlist. But yeah, so I'll go over adding to local storage and accessing from local storage. So that's again something important that's going to be part of your assessment next week. Also, we'll go over some Bootstrap stuff that maybe will be helpful. So I'm going to pause recording here then, if I remember how to.